Well, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome back to Don't Get Rusty here at AOPA. As you can see on the screen, today's topic is no engine, no problem. This is glider concepts for powered pilots. And I'm really excited about this episode because we've got our special guest, Scott Manley, on with us, who we'll introduce here in a moment. And it's going to be cool. It's going to really make you think about some different things. So I'm excited that you guys are here. But before we begin, as always, let's take care of a few of those housekeeping things. First of all, just the mechanics on how to use the display that you're using with GoToWebinar. If you are on a computer, you'll see the attendee control panel looking something like this. And then the key part for is we'd love to hear from you if you have questions and things like that. So you'll want to find that little bubble that looks like a question mark, then go down to here where it says ask the staff a question, type in your question or comment, and then make sure you hit that send button, because if you don't hit the send button, we won't see it. If you're on a tablet, iPad, Android, something along those lines, then your control panel is going to look something more like this. You're looking for that question mark right there. You want to type your question in right here and then make sure that you click the send button. So that's the key part. Make sure you click and send if you want us to see what you've written. Otherwise, we will not see it. My name, as always, is Chris Moser. I am the Senior Director of Flight Training Education here at AOPA. I am a CFI and a teacher and all kinds of other stuff. And basically here I work on AFTA and the Flight Training Experience Survey and Awards. And with us today, our special guest is Scott Manley, educator, super CFIG, math teacher, and he looks really young in that picture. Scott, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I think I talk to people about my flight instruction world. I tell people I came into flight instruction through the back door. I was a teacher before I was a pilot. And so I approach the whole topic differently than typical flight instructors. It's an educational process for me. And so that's kind of the world I come from.
Cool. Well, thanks again, Scott, so much for being here. I know you were on with us a couple of months ago doing the glider presentation, sort of intro to soaring. But today, we're really going to blow their minds with this idea of what speeds potentially they should be thinking about using. All right, let's go ahead and throw it over to Dan. As always, Dan, say hi.
Oh, hi. You threw that one. You stole that one right from me. Oh, I was ready to cue that up for Steven. It's all good. I'm still going to do it. You know, we can't just be one and done on that. But hey, everybody, Dan Justman, Vice President of You Can Fly. Excited to be with you today. I get to work with the high school, the Flight Training Initiative, the Flying Clubs Initiative, and the Rusty Pilots Initiative as well. Instrument rated private pilot, and I love the idea of today's topic. I'm really excited to listen in and help facilitate questions. Thank you. And with that, I would like to introduce Steven. Steven, say hello.
Hello, Steven. That's it. And so I'm the coordinator with the Flight Training Initiative. I work directly with Chris and Dan here. I get to get my hands on all kinds of different loose strings and things and help out with all of our different programs. So it's been a great ride so far, enjoying the process. And just to let everybody know, I am running a marathon this weekend. I've been training all year for this. So wish me luck.
Go get them.
Yes, Steven has been out running things like I did 12 miles this weekend. We're like, you're crazy, man. But yeah, it's going to be really cool when you wrap that up. So can't wait to hear about it. All right. And then Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, just wanted to mention to everyone, Don't Get Rusty and all the other You Can Fly programs are funded by generous donations to the AOPA Foundation. Not a dollar of the stuff that we do on this team is funded by AOPA member dues. So we are very grateful for all of those that want to continue to support general aviation, grow it, keep it safe. And if you would like to contribute, please do so through the AOPA Foundation at aopafoundation.org. And would also like to thank the Jeppesen, ForeFlight, and Boeing family of companies who have generously sponsored the Don't Get Rusty webinar. We would not be able to do that without them. Great tools, services, and products available for all facets of general aviation and beyond. So thank you all to the Boeing, ForeFlight, and Jeppesen family of companies.
Dan, I am thinking that the PowerPoint that I downloaded may not be the one we edited that. So let's give them also that part about AOPA.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I had noticed that as well, but you're right. That slide won't be on there. But also, you know, the AOPA Foundation is linked very closely to AOPA. We are one and the same, little bit different missions for what we're doing there. But if you're not an AOPA member, we encourage you to do so. We encourage you to become a member of the world's largest aviation community. You can do your part to protect your freedom to fly. Be a part of that and support those efforts. We've got a great government affairs team that is active at the national, at the state, and also at the regional level with the Airport Support Network group of pilots on stage, keeping their finger on the pulse of what's happening at just about each and every airport across the country. You can stay informed. We've got world-class, award-winning print and e-newsletter publications. So great information there for you to keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening in general aviation. There's a wealth of resources available. Access to our pilot information center. You can call up a CFI, someone who's worked with the FAA. Great resources available, information. If you've got a question about general aviation, we can answer that. And the pilot information center is available for those to call in or email or chat. So available any way that you want to get that information and get that connection, we can do that for you. You can be a better, safer pilot through the Air Safety Institute programs, our pilot continuing education programs. You get great rates on quality aviation products and services for like pilot protection, financial services, and then great savings, exclusive savings for our members, hotels, rental cars, and all sorts of things like that. So if you're interested and are not yet a member, we encourage you to visit aopa.org/membership and become one. Thank you.
Cool. All right, and then don't forget, Dan, you want to talk about the wings credit if folks might be interested in that?
Absolutely. We know it's going to come. We know the question's going to hit. Is there wings credit? Yes. If you are viewing this live broadcast, you are eligible for wings credit. If you have registered with your FAAsafety.gov email address, everything's done, all set. We'll take care of the rest. It'll take a couple days to post, but we'll take care of it for you, so no problem there. So yes, wings credit for those viewing live today. FAAsafety.gov email address. If you're not sure if that's email address or you want to let us know otherwise, please email ftinitiative@aopa.org, ftinitiative@aopa.org, and Stephen will be able to get that updated for you. Also, today's presentation will be recorded. So yes, it will show up on our YouTube page. Look under the playlist for Don't Get Rusty webinars on AOPA pilot video page. You can also access at aopa.org. So these will be recorded. So if there's something that you didn't quite get answered or want to dig back in because it was some great information, you're able to do that. It just takes a couple days to get posted, but once that is loaded up and in there, you will have free access to that and the complete library of Don't Get Rusty webinars.
All right, Stephen, what about this day in aviation history?
Did we mention that in November 16th, 1915, Victor Karlstrom was the first pilot to fly from Toronto to New York? Took him 6 hours and 40 minutes in that biplane, so just open to the weather. Coincidentally, Victor was a Swedish immigrant who came over to the U.S. in, I want to say it was 1914, no, 1904. 1904. Anyway, interesting guy to look up if you get a chance to read about him.
That looks cold.
Right.
It looked like it was very cold.
And you can still experience that today. Just turn off your heater. All right, and then let's go ahead and just very quickly run our poll. Today's poll, obviously with the theme of gliders and sailplanes. What's the best lesson to be learned from gliders and sailplanes? Want to go ahead and roll the poll, Stephen? And your choices, of course, are A, lift equals life. Is that your best lesson learned? B, better make that landing the first time. C, tip your tow pilot. D, you're always one engine failure away from becoming glider pilots. Or E, don't take off unless the engine is running. So let's see what folks are saying there. And so Scott, what do you think people might say on this one, or what would you choose?
My favorite is number 4. You're one engine failure away from becoming a glider pilot.
Very cool. I like the tip your tow pilot one because I think that's a good idea. I know that you're a tow pilot. Does anybody ever actually tipped you when you've done it?
They have not, but I tipped my tow pilot with a bottle of brandy.
There you go. Hopefully after the flight, not before, because that would be bad. Okay, so it looks like we've got about 57% of folks getting in. We'll just give you another couple of moments to see what people are saying. And then The one thing I do know that I remember that freaked me out when I did my own glider training was the first time I was soloing and having to nail the spot. I remember going up without my instructor and then realizing I can't go around. So that idea of you're going to make this landing the first time because that's all you got, that really sunk in. But luckily, it wasn't as scary as I thought it would be. Because old Jan Driesen actually was my instructor, and he trained me pretty well. All right, let's go ahead and close the poll. We've got about 75%. Let's see what the results are here. And look at that, Scott. You have picked out what people really seem to think, which is that one engine failure away from becoming a pilot, by far the most popular one, then followed by a lift equals life and better make that landing the first time. And then we have a tie. I think it's the first time. Tip your toe pilot with 2% versus don't take off unless the engine's running. Okay, let's go ahead and bring it back. And the big thing now is let's go ahead and throw the presentation over to Scott. So we're going to switch control of that. And Scott is going to take over and start the new presentation. So I'm really looking forward to this, Scott. Time to dazzle us.
All right.
We're up and running.
Are we all set? Very good.
Yep, all good.
Good day, folks. I've done this presentation a number of times, a couple of times at Oshkosh this summer, where it was entitled Glider Concepts for Powered Pilots. I prefer to label it as stuff I learned to fly flying gliders that I wish I had known when I was flying airplanes. So this is just a whole bunch of stuff that I think you might find useful in your airplane flying. I know that I would have. So just a quick overview, a little bit of background. I started out flying airplanes, and then about 20 years after that, got my experience in a glider and got my glider rating. If I had it to do over again, I would have done it the other way around. Just learning to fly a glider just made me a better airplane pilot, and so I would just want to point that out. Topics for today, I'm going to talk a little bit about glide aerodynamics and then aircraft performance. We're going to talk about your weight. No, not that weight. I know you're working on it, the aircraft weight.
How did you know?
I'll have a summary and some recommendations for you, and then we'll get into the Q&A.
Cool.
So a glide. I usually like to go look at a definition of things that I'm talking about, and here's the one that I found in the dictionary. Not particularly happy with that. Having a physics background, I decided to change the definition of glide to having a horizontal component to a free fall. The suggestion being here, of course, that this is a gravity-driven event in which the miracle of aerodynamics lets us, in some cases, generate a horizontal component to that free fall, the result being what I would call a gliding flight path. A couple important concepts there. The amount of horizontal we can get out of the vertical we have available to us, it's typically referred to as glide ratio. But this is another important concept, at least in glider world, that we don't necessarily think about a lot in airplane world, which is how long it's going to be before we're on the ground. So we call it sink rate, and airplane world is usually vertical speed. So here's the typical aerodynamics diagram that you'll see for level powered flight, where you have an airfoil being acted on by gravity. That airfoil is being pulled through the air along its flight path at an angle of attack, which generates then what is referred to as the aerodynamic force. You don't often hear it referred to in that term. Instead, you hear it referred to as its component parts, lift and drag, where lift opposes gravity and drag is opposing thrust. So the question is, in gliding flight, when either you release from the tow plane or you release from the winch or you shut off the motor in the glider, and there are any number of gliders that have self-launch capability, what happens when the thrust goes away? The answer is that the glider aircraft keeps moving forward. It just changes its flight path into something a little more like this. The aircraft senses that as an increase in angle of attack and uses its longitudinal stability to reestablish the angle of attack along the flight path. So you now have a system of three vectors, any two of which will counterbalance the other one. So the question often comes in, well, where is the thrust? If the thrust is gone, what is it that makes the aircraft move forward along its flight path? And the answer kind of comes into the resolution of vectors in the same way that the lift and drag components of aerodynamic generate the aerodynamic thrust that opposes gravity. The lift and gravity components actually combine to produce what I would call a pseudo thrust. And so it's actually the combination of the lift vector and the gravity vector, which drive the aircraft along its flight path. All right, this is I'm about to present you something that you see in all glider aircraft flight manuals. What they do in the certification and testing process of a glider is that they fly it through its entire speed range, starting down here near stall speed. And at each of those speeds, they note the sink rate of the glider. And they do that through the whole speed range of the aircraft. And then they plot the points on that curve, and the result is something referred to as a glide polar. It's basically the glide performance chart for the aircraft. So what can you do with this glide polar? If you're looking for the best possible glide ratio you can get, which would be the flattest possible glide, you can use the glide polar to figure out what that is by drawing a tangent to the glide polar. It does a couple things. It'll give you the glide ratio. So this tangent point occurs at 60 knots and 2 knots of sink. So the glide ratio there is 30 to 1. That's the best glide ratio you can do, and it's often referred to as the best lift over drag ratio. And it occurs at what is referred to as the best glide airspeed. It turns out that it's not actually an airspeed. It is a unique angle of attack, which is where the discussion for this presentation comes into. In our aircraft flight manuals, we have this number called the best glide airspeed. And what you need to understand, or what I came to understand in the world of gliding, is that is almost never the right speed to be flying. It's the only one that's given to us in the airplane flight manual, and pretty much the only one that's given to us in the glider flight manual, but in most cases, it is not the proper speed to be flying. And we're gonna talk about that in some length. You don't have a glide polar in your aircraft. What you have is typically a drag curve diagram, where you've seen one in your training, where you have parasite drag increasing with airspeed and induced drag decreasing with airspeed, and then the total drag curve. It turns out that your best glide ratio occurs where the total drag of the aircraft is at its minimum, and the airspeed at which that occurs is the best glide airspeed. Now, that is what I would refer to as the aerodynamic best glide airspeed, meaning that that's your best glide within the air mass that you're flying in. We're going to talk a little bit more about what I refer to as the geographic best glide, because that's the one that really counts. All right, so here we are at the aerodynamic best glide, and the glide speed is 60. The question is, what happens at airspeeds less than that? Well, you would expect that you're not going to get a glide performance as good, since it's actually the best glide at 60. What you'll get is something less than that. And in this particular case, you have the airspeed and glide ratio coming out to about 20 to 1. What's kind of interesting about this, and was a little bit surprising to me, is that that same glide ratio can be achieved at a much higher speed. In fact, at something like 93 over 7.1 will also give you the 20 to 1 glide ratio. This is not particularly as useful as it is interesting, unless you're a glider pilot. If we knew that 20 to 1 was going to get us home, we have the option of either getting there slowly because we're giving somebody a ride and we like the ride to last a while, or we can get there quickly because we're trying to set some kind of a record. Again, not particularly interested for airplane pilots, so I'm going to jump past this. By the way, the degradation in glide performance at speeds less than 60 knots is a result of the preponderance of induced drag at those high angles of attack. And the degradation in your glide performance on the high side is a result of parasitic drag due to the high air speeds. All right, so another interesting point on the performance curve of a glider is this one, at which the sink rate is at its minimum. The airspeed at which that occurs in glider world is referred to as the minimum sink airspeed. This is a number, again, that you won't see published in your aircraft flight manuals. Rather than think about as minimum sink airspeed, what I like to think about it is maximum time aloft. And we're going to talk about that more a little later and why that's important, why that can be very important for airplane pilots. Again, a number that's not in your book, and I'll talk to you about how you can come up with that. All right, so in the glider world, there is this concept referred to as speed to fly. And you hear about it all the time, speed to fly, speed to fly, speed to fly. And I'm always thinking, well, what is better than just glide speed? What is this speed to fly thing? I could never find a definition for it. So as an educator, I had to come up with one. And here is my definition of the concept of speed to fly. And I'll take you through a few examples of it.
Hey, Scott, real quick, just before you keep going, this question you're going to like, because we got it from the audience, and it was literally one you told me to ask, which is, why is it called a polar?
Why is it called a polar? It's usually a bonus question that I ask out. It would take a little bit of explaining, but there are two types of multispatial geometry. One is called Cartesian geometry, where you're using an X and Y coordinate to describe a point in space. Polar geometry can do the same thing. It can locate a position in two-dimensional space using the angle from the origin and a distance from the origin. And so really what's going on in a glide polar is that the airspeed is not being measured across the top of as a horizontal component. It's actually being measured down the flight path. And the glide angle that's achieved at that airspeed is what's important. And so really the glide polar is based on glide angle and airspeed down the flight path, which is what polar geometry does. And therefore it's called a glider polar.
Cool. And then one other one real quick, and I want to just help out folks, because I was thinking of this when you talked on that last slide. Sometimes we have student pilots that are on and things like that. There's the difference between parasitic and induced drag. But I think we could maybe just do the simple version of induced drag is as you're going slower and it's a result of lift. So it's that lift vector getting pushed backwards more as you increase angle of attack. That's as you slow down, you're gonna get more induced drag, result of lift. And as you go farther forward, it's the same thing as like running or in a car, all that air hitting the front of the car or your hand, if you have your hand out the car window, the faster you go, the more resistance you feel. That's the parasitic drag. It's just the resistance of the air of you moving through it. Hope that covers it. Back to you, Scott. Sorry about that.
All right, very good. So speed to fly, the definition of speed to fly is the airspeed that will maximize the aircraft's performance to achieve a specific flight objective in a given situation. So let's go to our situation where the situation is we're flying the aircraft on a calm day, and for one reason or another, the aircraft engine decides to pack it in. The flight objective, at least mine would be, to land at the nearest airport, if at all possible. The performance requirement is I need to have my best glide over the ground, my best geographic best glide. In calm conditions, that's going to be the aerodynamic best glide, because the atmosphere isn't moving. So we don't have to combine our aircraft's glide motion through the air with the actual movement of the air. And so in this case, the speed to fly is going to be 60 knots.
And so just to confirm here, Scott, yeah, it's just for Scott, that is like the best glide, same best glide we would see published in the manual?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Correct. Well, yes and no, and you'll find out why no more later. So this is an example of speed to fly. Under this circumstance, based on what you're trying to do, which is land at an airport, and you want to maximize the performance that would allow that to happen, what is the speed to fly? And in this case, it is 60 knots. All right, so let's change the situation, and let's go with a headwind of 20 knots. The glider polar is useful in determining what's going on here. Again, your objective is to land at the airport. Your performance objective is your best glide over the ground. The polar will show you how to do that by, again, tracing from a tangent line to the curve from the 20-knot headwind. Now, it shouldn't be surprising to you that your glide ratio is not going to be as good. What may be surprising to you is that 60 knots is not the speed at which the polar tells us that the speed that you're going to achieve that glide ratio is not the number in the book. It's a speed faster than that. That's probably not intuitive, but that's the way it works. 65 knots is going to get you your best glide over the ground. If you fly at 60, you'll still get somewhere, but it's not as good as if you're, and by the way, it's not as good as it would be in calm air, but it's better than you're going to get flying at 60 if you speed the glider or speed the aircraft up. Again, not intuitive, something I never learned flying airplanes, something I learned flying gliders. By the way, the same effect is true if you're flying with a tailwind. Again, engine packs it in. Your objective is to land at an airport. You need the best glide over the ground. The polar tells you that you can actually achieve with a tailwind a better glide ratio than you could in a no-wind situation. It also tells you that you're not going to get that performance flying at the book number. You need to slow down if you're going to achieve best glide in a tailwind. 55 knots in this case. Okay, so just an example. Here you are in your Cessna 172 at the X, X being 6,000 feet above the ground, 1 nautical mile, headed in this direction. You have an airport in front of you at 7 miles. You got one behind you at 11 miles. The engine packs it in. Your flight objective becomes land at an airport. Logically, you would go for the one in front of you. Your best glide over the ground is going to be based on 60 knots, which is a number in the book. I'm going to assume generously that the glide ratio of 152 is 10 to make the math easy. And 60 knots is going to get you a 10-to-1 glide ratio, which will get you to the airport in front of you, and clearly not the one behind you. The situation changes when you're flying into a 20-knot tailwind. The objective is again, I'm sorry, 20-knot headwind, I'm sorry. The objective is again to land at the airport. Again, you want your best glide performance over the ground. But here's what is not intuitive. If you chose the best glide speed into a 20-knot headwind, you would be flying at about 80 knots. At 80 knots, the best you can do is going to be less than 7-to-1. You're not going to get to that airport in front of you, even though you're flying at what you believe is the best speed to fly in that situation. Here's what is interesting and again, not intuitive. If you turn this aircraft around and fly the other direction and slow the aircraft down to 55 knots, you will achieve a 13-to-1 glide ratio, and you'll make it to that airport behind you, whereas you will not make it to the airport in front of you. Again, completely counterintuitive. Nobody would turn around and try to fly to the airport behind them, and nobody would slow the aircraft down in the process of doing that. It's just not what you've been told to do, and it's not intuitive. Thus, this presentation.
Yeah, and this is the fascinating part. I just want to respond to the audience out there. I see people asking questions like, how do I figure this out? I know you're going to talk about that in a little bit for them to know how they can start to determine some of these types of speeds on their own in the airplane, correct?
Yeah, the quick answer is, and I'll talk about it more in just a little bit later, is you need to develop your own glide polar for the aircraft. You need to experimentally go up and develop it because your manufacturer didn't do that. And I'll talk to you about how you do that. All right, so here we are back in the, by the way, this headwind tailwind thing is not the only thing that affects your glide performance. It could be that the situation is, so here's the situation in just the calm air situation. But you may find yourself in rising air. So how does that affect what's going on? Well, rising air basically represents a reduced sink rate. And if you, again, use the polar to figure out what was going on, if your objective is to land at the furthest airport and your glide performance is best glide over the ground, what the polar will tell you is that you can get a dramatically improved glide ratio if you're flying in rising air. And again, how would you know you're in rising air? Well, you would have to know what your normal sink rate was with your engine out, and that's part of what you're going to have to learn to do. But if you see that your sink rate is less than that, you need to slow down. And again, that is not counterintuitive. If my engine just quit and I'm trying to get that airport in front of me, the last thing I would do is slow down. That is completely counterintuitive, but that is what's going to help guarantee that you get there, because this is the way glide performances work in rising air. We'd slow down to about 52 knots. By the same token, if you happen to fly into sinking air has the equally dramatic effect of punishing your glide ratio. Now, this is the best you're going to do in 3 knots of sink, which is not uncommon on days when you have cumulus clouds. It's an ugly looking glide ratio, but it's the best you're going to get. But you're not going to get it at 60 knots. You're going to have to speed way the heck up just to achieve the best that you can possibly do. Just as an example, if you did decide to stay at 60, that's what's going to be the result. It's going to be much worse than even what you thought was bad already.
And just to translate too, because I know that obviously most airplanes are not going to have the knots going to be like on a variometer and a glider. They'd be using like the vertical speed indicator, correct? For the sync.
Yes, to your vertical speed indicator. Yep. Yeah. Yep. So you'd probably be in 100 feet per minute rather than a knot is roughly 100 feet per minute. So you can, if I talk to you about knots, you can just translate that to 100 feet a minute. So if your normal sync rate was 500 feet a minute and you flew into 700 feet a minute, you don't want to stay at 60. You need to speed that aircraft up and get moving if you're going to achieve your best glide ratio. All right. Here's another situation. You are not within glide distance of an airport. And so now that the engine just packed it in, I would like to suggest to you that your objective is to not glide anywhere. Your objective is to stay in the air as long as you can. And why would that be? You need time to possibly restart the engine, figure out why it quit. Barring that, or even with that, you're going to need to brief your passengers on what's about to happen. You're going to need time to configure the aircraft for what's about to happen. You'll need time to find and maybe survey your best place to land, assuming that you're not going to land at an airport. Mm-hmm. And you might want to declare an emergency. So your flight objective here is to maximize your time aloft, to minimize your sync rate and stay up there as long as you can to get done what you need to get done. That's going to occur at the aircraft's minimum sync speed. And again, that's not best glide. It's typically somewhat well below that. In this case, 48 knots, minimum sync is where you want to be. And again, how do we determine minimum sync in an airplane? You're just going to have to experimentally do it. You're going to have to go out and fly your aircraft, bring the aircraft to idle, and then start slowing the aircraft down until you see a indication on your vertical speed indicator, which is at a minimum. You go any slower than that, you'll see the sync rate start to increase again on the left side of the curve. So what you're looking for is the minimum sync rate, and then you're looking for the airspeed that gives you that minimum sync rate. That's going to be your aerodynamic minimum sync rate. It's the one you want to go to in this situation because it buys you the most time to get done the stuff you need to get done.
And this fits in with somebody just asked a question too. They said, you know, they get the idea of potentially slowing down in some of these situations, but the question being, like, what if it gets you close to the stall? Do you, in your experience with all this stuff, do you typically find that getting these speeds get you anywhere close to the stall speed?
No. I mean, you are getting closer, but not close enough that you need to worry about it.
Okay.
In fact, I guess you'll know once you determine what your minimum sync speed is, you can compare that to what your stall speed is in that same configuration, and you'll know how close you are to stall. So yeah, I think you'd have to you'll have to determine it experimentally.
Right. So typically though, it's not like you're on the edge of a stall trying to do this stuff.
Well, certainly in a glider where the speed range is less than it is in an airplane, minimum sync is reasonably close to stall.
Okay.
But again, you learn to fly the aircraft in that configuration. It's part of your training. And I would suspect with the wider speed range of an airplane, you're going to be further from stall than you would be in a glider for sure. But again, you're going to have to experimentally determine that, figure that out for yourself, and then take that into consideration in the event that you know you need to slow down to minimize your sync rate.
Go ahead, Dan.
Hey guys, quick question related to that, and with these calculations, Scott, we've had 3 in a row. Curious about how sensitive all these calculations are to weight. Is the sync rate dependent on weight? Will the speeds changed? A lot of questions real quick focused on that.
Yep, and I'm going to cover that in just a bit.
It's coming up.
Apparently, these people are either psychic, they've seen the presentation before, or they've studied this kind of thing, or they were hinted by the hint was in the early part of the presentation where I said we need to talk about your weight. Yeah, I'm getting to it in a second. So off-airport landings. Just for the heck of it, I did a search. I mean, I certainly have my notions about doing off-airport landings in a glider, but I thought, well, I wonder if there's stuff available online in terms of off-airport landings in an airplane, and certainly there are. Interestingly enough, the first search I found was at an AOPA website, and I think the reference that I found, Chris has in your handout.
Yes, the handout, we've got lots of links to these articles, AOPA, and some of the other references. I did forget to put the bold method on there, but I think they'll be able to search that one out.
Yep. Also found, if you do the same search, bold method will show up. They did a pretty good presentation on what to do if you're not going to land on an airport. Just from a glider pilot's perspective, we always have this dilemma. Do we land in a cultivated field? Do we land in a pasture? Do we land on a road? Landing on a road tends to be a pretty bad idea in general because of the wide wings. The only kind of roads you might be able to land on are wide lanes, and then you're out there with traffic. Narrow roads are not going to work because they're full of road signs and mailbox posts and all kinds of other things that are going to take your wings off. So we'll typically land on a road in a last resort, maybe out, out in the west someplace where there's nothing out there but the road. You're okay. Pastures are not a particularly good choice because the reason that there are animals grazing in that pasture is because that field typically isn't good for anything else. It's probably full of rocks and stumps. It's probably not level, and it's a pretty lousy place. And if it does have animals in it, especially if it only has one animal in it, you don't want to land there. That one animal is typically in there by himself for a good reason.
Probably a bull.
Yeah, exactly. So cultivated fields is my first choice to land out in. You kind of want to keep an eye on and be aware of what's growing over the areas that you're going to be flying, because in the spring those things tend to be really small. The cultivated field has just been, all the rocks have been taken out of it. It's been nice and smoothed out. It's actually a very nice place to land. The crops are kind of small, but later on, some of those 2 and 3 inch crops become 8 and 10 foot crops. Still survivable, but if you got an option between that and maybe a soybean field next to it, or a recently harvested wheat field, it pays to pay attention to what's going on agriculturally over areas that you're going to fly. In general, you just want to pay more attention to your available off-airport options and route accordingly. So as glider pilots, we don't fly over large forested areas. We don't fly over large bodies of water because the landing options are just not very good there. One of the things you'll want to do, if you possibly can, as you arrive over a land out area, is to arrive with enough altitude to actually do an aerial survey, kind of circle the area and look for obstructions. Typically, your worst obstructions landing in a field are going to be power lines, and you can't see power lines, and it's even hard to see the poles that hold them up. The indications there might be power lines nearby. Typically, if there's a road on one edge of the field, there are likely power lines running along it. What you can look for is the pole shadows. That would indicate that there are in fact power lines there, and you may want to pick which way you go into the field based on that. I usually recommend that you land closer to the middle of the field rather than flying a typical approach where you might try to approach the edge of the field and then roll into it, because the obstacles you're going to hit are going to be near the edges. And so if you've got the altitude and wherewithal to think about it, you might want to plan on landing a little closer to the middle of the field and avoid the edges. You certainly want to land into the wind if you can, so you want to be aware of what's going on there. And if you happen to be landing on slope terrain, you are better off landing uphill with a tailwind than to land downwind with a headwind.
Or downhill, you mean, with a headwind?
Downhill, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're going to come to a much quicker stop if you're rolling uphill, even if you're landing with a tailwind. So a couple of my thoughts on. By the way, my objective in flying a glider was to never land out. I think for me, landing out is like running out of gas. It is completely optional, and you just end up in that situation typically. By the way, the glider pilots hate it when I say this stuff, but I swore that I was never going to land out, and I just never did. I flew my flight so I would never have to land out because it takes all the fun out of it for me.
Yeah, that would be a kind of a drag. Real quick, somebody did ask, they said, how can you tell the difference between these types of fields? And I know, and you can verify this or not, but I know that I read in the Tom Knopf book, it was gliders for powered pilots, and he mentioned the idea of the color of it. Obviously paying attention to the crops, like you said, is really important. But he mentioned you see a freshly plowed field, you can kind of tell those look like that darker brown. That's that freshly plowed. Then lighter green, because that's going to tell you lower crops. Darker green is when you're getting into the thicker crops, and that's probably what you want to try to potentially avoid.
Yeah, and also if you simply pay attention to these things while you're on the ground, in terms of what's growing and how tall it is and so forth, and then you fly over that same area, you now have a point of reference, which is, okay, if this is what I see from the air, that's what I'm dealing with on the ground. Because an alfalfa, if you haven't looked at them before, an alfalfa field can look just like a cornfield, but there's a big difference in what's going to happen when you land in one or the other. So just something to think about.
Two questions. Folks asking,
Yeah.
what does land out mean? It's a quick one, I know.
Go ahead.
So the idea of landing out is just the glider pilot's term for landing in a field, because unlike a powered pilot where we always want to land on the runway, glider pilots, if they're out there doing their thing, it's not uncommon for them on a cross country to end up kind of stretching that performance and end up landing in a field somewhere rather than making it back to the airport. So for them, they call it landing out, right out away from the field, I suppose, or out away from the airport.
Yeah, and you can even extend that definition a little bit to not landing at the airport you took off from.
Okay.
You have landed out, but you've safely landed at another airport. So,
okay.
Yeah, that's maybe another extension of landing out. All right, so this speed to fly stuff using a glide polar, you're not going to be carrying a glide polar in your aircraft, and if you are, you're not going to be referring to it when the engine quits. So we have just some rules of thumb in the gliding world that have to do with speed to fly. The first one is if you're flying into a headwind and you want to achieve your best glide, you need to speed up. And the question is, well, how much do I speed up? Well, for the lower performance gliders that we fly, it's typically you'll take the speed that's in the book and you'll add the wind speed. So if you're flying along at, if your best glide speed is 60 knots and you're flying into a 20 knot headwind, speed up to 80 if you're flying in an airplane. Slow down in a tailwind. And the question is, well, how much? And my recommendation is just go back to your minimum sink speed. What's affecting your glide ratio the most is your descent rate. And if you can minimize that, you're going to get the best glide, at least in a tailwind situation. If you happen to fly into sinking air, again, speed up, as we saw, for a couple of reasons. One is it will improve your glide performance, even as bad as it is. It's better than staying at the published book number. And it's kind of like the running through rain theory. You need to get out of that sinking air, and by speeding up, you'll spend less time there. My recommendation would be add 10 knots to your airspeed for every additional knot of abnormal sink. So if you happen to know, you've done your experimentation, you know that your normal sink rate's 500 feet a minute and you fly into 700 feet a minute, speed up 20 knots. Okay, now if you happen to run into what I refer to as continuous abnormal sink, in other words, you hit some sink area. Sink is typically, you'll typically find it in the vicinity of cumulus clouds, where the air that went up into the clouds is now coming back down on the outside of it. You may fly in a situation that looks like the one in the picture on the right here. This situation typically occurs on somewhat windier days where the cumulus clouds, which have lift underneath them, kind of line up in rows. And we, as glider pilots, we call these energy lines or cloud streets, and we'll just fly underneath those, and we don't have to circle much of the time. We can just fly under those and just keep taking the lift off each progressive cloud and just fly for miles and miles and miles in a straight line. That's the fun part. The fact that the air is going up along those cloud streets or those energy lines, guess where it's coming down? In the clear space in between. Now, if there's not enough moisture in the air, these energy lines can still exist without the formation of clouds. And so you may in fact be flying along on your glide to what you think is a safe landing at an airport, and you hit an unusually long extended period of sink. You're probably on one of these sink streets. And the best way to get off the street is to make a 90-degree turn, fly to the side a little bit, get off the street, and then proceed back on your course where the sink rate has improved. And again, you would want to slow down in rising air. How much? My recommendation, down to your minimum sink speed. That'll improve your glide ratio dramatically, minimize your descent rate, and maximize your time in the rising air so that it improves your glide rate.
And before you do the weight thing, Scott, I just wanted to say here real quick too that we talked about before is that we know that we're giving you some ideas, and I know it blows your mind. I know this stuff too is like I'm a very, very novice glider pilot, and the stuff that I'm still learning. But the big thing I want to say is, if in doubt and you don't know better, use your best glide speed. But with some training, especially, I know you're going to talk about it later, Scott, with some glider training or working with the CFI and a little experimentation, you might be able to take these concepts and use them to get even better performance out of your airplane. But if in doubt, that best glide speed, that's the thing to do until you figure this stuff out and get the training. Would you agree with that, Scott? Or
I would agree. Yeah, the best glide speed is the place to go. And if you happen to know this other stuff, there are there are ways you can improve on that.
Yeah.
But just going to the glide speed is a great first step.
Okay, cool.
You know, it probably gets you 80% of where you need to go. And then the rest of this stuff is going to get you the other 20, but the other 20 can make a difference between whether you get there or not. So
exactly. Let's talk about our weight problem now.
All right, weight problem. So your best glide ratio is a function of aerodynamics. It is independent of weight. A heavy aircraft will glide at the same glide ratio as a light aircraft. I know that makes no sense, but that's the way it works. The best glide speed published in your book is based on the aircraft being at its maximum gross weight. I don't know about you, but I very rarely flew the aircraft at maximum gross weight, almost never. It is a specific angle of attack at which you will achieve this best glide speed, but we don't have angle of attack indicators typically on an aircraft. If you did, we want to be flying best glide based on angle of attack. But here's how it actually works. The weight of the glider is being supported by the lift being generated. And that has this formula that you'll see, where the coefficient of lift is basically based on angle of attack and the shape of the wing. If you get rid of all of the stuff that you can't do anything about, the air density, the surface area of the wing, the shape of the wing, what you'll see is that the lift that the aircraft is generating is based on angle of attack and airspeed, the relationship of those two. Now, knowing that you're going to get best glide at a specific airspeed, this becomes a constant. And so if you're flying at any weight less than maximum gross weight, the lift required to support that weight is less. And since the airspeed, the best glide is going to occur at an angle of attack, the only way to adjust for that is to adjust your speed. And so basically what I'm telling you is that if you're flying at anything less than your gross weight, your best glide is going to be achieved at a speed less than the number in the book. Another reason that that number in the book is not correct. So let's take a look at example. Cessna 172. Published best glide speed 65 knots, gross weight 2,550 pounds, empty weight 1,650 or 1,680. I'm sorry. You just happen to be the now extinct FAA 170-pound pilot flying the aircraft at a quarter fuel load. So you're relatively light. The question is, if 65 is not the speed to be flying at this lightweight, what is the right speed? And here's how you find out. You take the loaded weight of the aircraft, you divide it by the gross weight. You take the square root of that and you multiply it by the number in the book. So it's going to look like this. We'll fill in the numbers. We'll do the division. We'll do the square root. We'll do the multiplication. There's your answer. If you're flying light and the engine packs in and you're trying to get your best glide, it is not at the book number. It's at something considerably less than the book number because it's not about the speed, it's about the angle of attack, and you don't have an angle of attack indicator. So speed is your best alternative. By the way, this doesn't just apply to best glide speed because best glide speed is not a speed, it's an angle of attack. So are these other speeds. Your best rate of climb, or your best angle of climb, I'm sorry, is not a speed, it's an angle of attack. And at this light weight, it's not the number in the book, it's less than that. Your best rate of climb is not going to be the number in the book under this light loading, it's going to be something less than that. Again, based on that same formula. Here's an important one. Your maneuvering speed is not going to be the speed in the book, which is based on maximum gross weight, it is going to be something considerably less than that. Again, it's counterintuitive that you've got to slow down if you're lighter in turbulence, but that's the way it works. Your minimum sink speed, once you figure out what it is also going to be proportionally affected, as will all of your stall speeds, but I don't recommend dropping those any lower than they are. Just pay attention to those. Leave them at the higher end.
And hang on 1 second, Scott, because I already think I know what's coming. Go ahead, Dan.
Is there any way we could see that formula again? We're getting peppered with that question. Is there a way to bounce back?
No, absolutely not.
There you go for all of those asking.
Give a moment to get that one. We're very close. You're doing an amazing job, Scott, and this stuff is cool. I love it.
Yep, I know. I gotta get moving. I would have got through this if you guys didn't keep interrupting.
You're okay on time though. You're okay.
No, that's all right.
I'm watching. You're good. But real quick, somebody asked too. I said, if you had while they're looking at that formula, if you had an angle of attack indicator, what would you look for best glide? So it would really be figuring out what your I guess the best glide speed. How would you figure that without it? And you know what the angle of attack is.
If you have an angle of attack indicator, you don't need the speed.
Right.
The angle of attack, the best glide angle of attack is always the same, regardless of weight. That's why the military flies angle of attack indicators. Sometimes they're carrying bombs and sometimes they aren't. And when they need to maximize their performance, it's all relative to angle of attack.
Yep. Okay.
So if you had an angle of attack indicator,
is how to figure that out, though, is what he's asking. I think it's like
you don't care about best glide speed anymore if you got an angle of attack indicator.
Right.
By the way, minimum sink is also an angle of attack. All of these things are angle of attack. Yep.
All right, go ahead. Let's go ahead and proceed forward. We have one more slide before we hit the related resources. Here we go.
All right, here's my summary of recommendations. Flying gliders is going to make you a better airplane pilot. By example, some of you may know about this aircraft. It was an Air Canada 767 that ran out of fuel at 44,000 feet over Manitoba, Canada, and the aircrew glided it safely to a landing at an airport. It turned out that the pilot of this aircraft was a glider pilot. First thing he did is he slowed the aircraft down to its best glide speed. By the way, the best glide speed is not published for 767. He guessed at it within 10 knots of the actual value. As he was approaching to land, he was too high, but he didn't have any engine power to drop flaps or other kinds of things. They manually dropped the gear. He put the aircraft into a slip, something we glider pilots routinely do if we find ourselves too high and we need a higher descent rate. He slipped a 767, a dead stick 767, and landed this thing on an airport. You may also be aware of this situation, the Miracle on the Hudson. Chesney Sullenberger was a glider pilot. And if you listen to the recordings that were part of that flight, you realize that he could tell just by his gliding experience and the performance of the aircraft under that circumstance, having never done it before, the only safe place he was going to land. He wasn't going to make it to any of the airports. He couldn't land on any of the city properties, so the only place he was going was into the water. Both glider pilots, both good results as a result of it. So my recommendation is if you're not going to actually get a full glider rating, at least go get some glider training so you can start to appreciate how some of this stuff works. You're going to have to get to know your glider's aircraft flight performance, and so you're going to need to go ahead and experimentally create a glide polar if you want to. And I would do that at a nominal loading rather than because you're not going to be flying around at gross weight, and if you do it at the weights that you might normally fly the aircraft, you'll already have the speeds that are calculated for you based on that. You'll want to determine your minimum sink airspeed. If this does happen to you, keep the speed to fly things in mind. If you're flying into headwinds, tailwinds, if you hit lift or sink on the way down. You want to build some experience with power off approaches. And I'm not just saying come into the traffic pattern and chop the power. Try some power off approaches from 5 miles out and see if you can get to the airport. And then from 10 miles out. Also practice your accuracy landings because you're going to need that if you go into a field. Get comfortable with controlling the descent of the glider in case you get back too high and you need to come down faster. Practice your ground reference maneuvers. Expand your flight planning. There's no reason you have to fly the GPS straight line. There's no reason you can't route a little bit so that you're closer to airports so you've got better options to land in. Same thing, fly higher altitudes buys you options. And then maintain your proficiency. Flight simulation is a great way to do that. Fly more often, especially with an instructor. And on every flight, practice some of this stuff. Don't just take off, fly someplace and land. Practice some of this stuff. Okay, related resources are, I think these are in the handout that Chris has got.
Yes.
So there's a couple of webinars that you can tune into. All right, I'm done.
All right, great. And one thing I'd recommend, I just thought about resources wise too, is that you can Google, the FAA has a glider flying handbook. And so that's free as a PDF download from the FAA. You can just Google that glider flying handbook and it'll explain some of the stuff too. The polars and things are in that book. So check that stuff out. Okay, let's go ahead and I'm trying to think for the time being, well, let's go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and take back the presentation. I'll put the part up. We'll just talk about next time, and then we'll take the Q&A because we have lots of Q&A, which is what I expected, and that's all good. So let me go ahead and grab this and do the old show my screen sharing.
By the way, I was just teasing about interrupting me. I think it's great when you interrupt.
No, it's all good, and it's like we just had so many really good questions, and I trust me, I was watching Scott. You did an amazing job as always at staying on your time, and so here we go. So the questions really quick. What we're going to do is we're going to do the official end of the webinar here, but Scott's sticking around with us, so we've got time. So this way we can get the folks out that need to get out by the end of the hour here. So for next time, Stephen, do you want to tell us a little bit about the AOPA Pilot Passport app and the code before we hit the next slide?
Sure. The Passport is part of the AOPA app. It's a function within that app. It links to a variety of different airports and maps and things we keep in our directory database, and is able to give you information about airports while you travel around. So much like a physical passport program, it's got ways where you can pull up information, check in at the airports. It earns points and badges as you do so. And every once in a while, our marketing folks throughout the year will do some contests based upon people's check-ins and such. So it's worth checking out. And coincidentally, we have a special badge for attending our program today. So you should see the code there on the left side and what the badge would look like over here on the right side.
All right, a couple things to note. This is not, I'll repeat that again, this is not for Wings credit. That code has nothing to do with Wings credit. It is more for the fun and the potential of maybe earning some prizes later on as AOPA marketing does that. So this has nothing to do with Wings credit. If you have registered with the same email that you use for FAAsafety.gov, we've got you covered for Wings credit. It's going to be automatically done, nothing you need to worry about. If you need to contact Stephen through the chat or email us at ftinitiative, that's flight training FT, Foxtrot Tango Initiative at AOPA.org. That's the way that if you need to, if you didn't register using the email that you use with your FAAsafety.gov account. All right, cool. Real quick, let's just talk about what's coming up next time, and then we're going to get to the questions because I know we've got plenty, and I'm really looking forward to discussing more of this with Scott. Our next episode will be December 21st, 2023, the last one for 2023, 12 to 1 Eastern or 1700 Zulu. And thank you for pointing it out because we had forgotten to change that with daylight savings this time around. And the next episode is called Critiquing the Angle. Aerodynamics are not a drag. We're going to talk a little bit more about aerodynamics. So I'm going to nerd out with you guys. I love this stuff. And so we had some requests about going into some advanced aerodynamics. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about things like lift and maneuvering speed and some of the other stuff. So I hope you'll join us for that one. If you have ideas for future topics, there's the email address, ftinitiative@aopa.org. Please let us know. Or also throw it in the chat right there too, and the questions, whatever. Just go ahead and put the question in, and you can give us ideas on other topics that you might like to see. Now, that said, let's get back to the questions. I know, Dan, we've got tons of questions I saw popping up there. So let's see what Scott can dazzle us with.
For sure. First, we had a call out, a shout out to our friend Brian Schiff. Apparently, he did a webinar last night for NAFI on how to crash an airplane. A lot of similar concepts, a little bit different presentation, but great information. So I encourage anyone to go access that as well. The ballistic method. Are we familiar with the ballistic method?
Scott, do you know that one?
Scott, Chris?
I don't know that one, no.
All right, well, we're going to leave that one for a later date and let people Google that one for the answer on that one. Maybe we'll get back to it at the end if we can.
I did use the ballistic method when I gave people rides in a glider. I would dive the glider and then put it into a climb and then push it over into a 0G and float them out of their seat. That's actually following a ballistic trajectory, which is why you go to zero gravity.
And that's why it works.
So
is there a
Go ahead.
Is there a database of glide polars available for common aircraft? Piper, Cessna, are we aware of a database of those resources?
No, I don't believe that glide polars are published for airplanes.
Okay.
And then, if I could, Dan, let's go back to that ballistic method. I'm looking at the question and see if this rings any bells, Scott. It said, this person's saying this method can work in the absence of specific information in the airplane flight manual if you need to estimate the best glide angle of attack in an emergency, or if you need to do that. The method involves trimming the aircraft for level flight and then gradually raising the nose until you achieve the slowest rate of descent while maintaining controlled flight. This will be close to best glide angle of attack. So they're kind of getting, it's kind of what you were saying, experimenting with the different speeds at a particular weight and getting your descent rate, I believe is what he's getting at.
Except that minimum descent rate is not best glide.
Right. That's your minimum sink in that case, right? That would be, yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
you do want to know that speed. With when the engine's out, what speed do you fly to sink as slowly as you can? You do want to know that. And again,
Right.
you'd want to do that at a nominal aircraft loading so that you're in the ballpark as opposed to what you'd be at max weight or very light.
So maybe pick an average of what you typically fly at. So,
Yep.
all right, go ahead.
That'd be my recommendation.
Lots and lots of interest about angle of attack indicators. And one specific question was, is that always the best tool? Does it provide appropriate speed to fly regardless of any conditions?
Yes, and that's why the military does it.
All right.
That's why Icon Aircraft put an angle of attack indicator in their aircraft. They're guys from the military that know that all of the stuff that we normally worry about in terms of what speed should I be flying on an approach, what speed should I be flying for landing, what speed should I, if I want a maximum dynamic turn, what speed should I be flying? Now I have to base that on the weight of the aircraft and the bank angle of the aircraft. All of that goes away with angle of attack.
All right. Here's one: a circumstance with an engine out. Can you deploy the flaps to achieve a slow landing, even though this will increase drag? I feel like that would be appropriate to what does the manual say in that one? What is the?
Yes, see, I'm looking for that one right now. Say that one again, Dan.
With the engine out, can you deploy the flaps to achieve a slow landing, even though this will increase drag?
So I don't know about you, because obviously on gliders, typically they're not flaps that I know of, usually spoilers and things, but on airplanes, normally we would keep flaps up until we know we have our field made. And then, yeah, if you know you've got your field made and you're coming in, I would definitely want to deploy the flaps. In fact, even on the checklist in the POH, oftentimes it'll say you keep that battery on, the master switch on, until you've finished configuring the aircraft, and then turn it off before you land. And that is typically like in a Cessna, for instance, with electric flaps, to let you deploy the flaps. So yeah, totally. If I was going into a field, I would use the flaps if I knew I had the field made to help me slow down as I was going into that landing. Would you agree, Scott, or any other thoughts on that one?
And part of knowing that you have the field made is what's going to happen once you put the flaps down. Because that's going to change your glide path, and it could do so considerably. And by the way, gliders do have flaps that move in both directions, up and down. Yeah.
I actually the rubber hybrid, not the ones I was flying, the trainers, but yeah, they recall that now.
Yep.
We've got a question related to AOA versus attitude indicator. Well, I don't have an angle of attack indicator. I do have an attitude indicator. Why not use that?
Do you want to take that one, Scott? Because the pitch is not necessarily going to be the same as angle of attack. It's not the same thing.
That's right. So why not use it? It's not an angle of attack indicator. It does not tell you angle of attack.
And to give you the quick example for that, for instance, is like I was doing spin training one time. I was in an extra, I got the luck to fly an extra 300 one time for about a half an hour or so. And I remember doing the spin and recovering from the spin, nose pointed down. So I think that's like 90 degrees pitch down. And I was still able to stall it because I did an accelerated stall accidentally by pulling before it was ready, and I stalled the airplane again. So that is not, and so therefore I exceeded critical angle of attack literally with my nose at the ground. So it really remember that it's the chord line versus the relative wind is your angle of attack, and so you could stall in any pitch attitude. So the attitude indicator is not going to be able to tell you what your angle of attack is.
How do flaps affect minimum sink rate?
Because they create more drag, they would increase your sink rate.
Okay. So a lot of interesting information here. Will the FAA or a DPE accept this during check rides? So this information presented, this different than what they've been trained to report to the DPE?
Yeah, I personally wouldn't do it on an airplane check ride. On a glider check ride, you're going to be expected to know this stuff. Right. Yeah, I try not to deviate from the norm in any kind of a flight test.
Right. Give them what they're expecting, is I would agree with that too. It's like you're going to know things. And in fact, one of the tips you always give to people taking check rides is answer the question and then stop talking, because what oftentimes happens is folks will end up talking themselves into a rabbit hole and then getting into stuff that they may not fully know or understand. So I would not do that on a check ride.
Yeah, my response is do what they expect you to do, and then once they hand you your pilot certificate and you're the pilot in command, do what you know you should do.
There you go. A fun comment that had a different perspective than you, Scott, about landing out. And it said some glider pilots seem to enjoy landouts for the adventure of meeting new people and bonding with their buddies who come to retrieve them. So I thought that was a great perspective in a little bit different direction.
Here's another perspective. What makes you think that the person whose property you just landed on is happy about this? We only hear the happy land out situations. We don't hear about the ones where they threaten to withhold your aircraft, or they're angry with you and they're not going to let you leave, and they call the police and all kinds of other things. There are those stories as well.
Right, because I've heard about that too. Like, because I've even heard with airplanes with engine outs, and you end up, and not that you shouldn't do it. Obviously, when it comes to saving your life, you do what you need to do to save your life and your passengers. That is all that matters, regardless of anything else. But yes, you'll hear of people with gliders and stuff. I've heard of stories where, like, you land in the crops, you take out a bunch of corn, now they want you to pay for all the crops they just lost, which is fair. It's a fair thing that you've destroyed their property. So yeah, that's a good point.
Here's an interesting one. When we were talking about landing out, what any considerations for landing on the beach or water? We know, Scott, you had mentioned that, you know, water's not a great option, so you purposely don't put yourself in that situation. But what if you're in there? Any considerations for landing on a beach?
I've never done either one. I think it would, yeah, I think if I had a choice between landing on a flat beach and landing in water, I would land on the flat beach. On the other hand, there's people on a beach. In that case, I'd land in the water. I would land in the water. You know, my emergency doesn't have to become somebody else's emergency.
Right.
That's another reason I'm not a fan of landing on roads. Your emergency you just made your emergency somebody else's emergency. I'm not a big fan of that.
Good point.
I did see it. There was a video of someone that too landed on the beach, but it was they purposely landed just off into the water. But of course, the good point though, if there's a bunch of people there now, there might be people in the water too. So try not to put yourself in these situations if you can.
There you go. Flight testing for your airplane's actual best glide speed would require accounting for a windmilling prop. In a hand-propped airplane with no starter, pilots would understandably be reluctant to shut off their engine. If at that speed, the prop would stop. Are there any rules of thumb for converting glide speeds at idle into glide speed without an engine?
Glider pilot, you're talking to the wrong guy.
Doesn't have the engine. Hey, that's a good question. That really isn't. And I would be the same way. I would be somewhat reluctant to want to shut my engine off and then, depending on it, firing it back up, because again, turning a practice into an emergency was not necessarily what I want to do. Now, I did ask someone who had engine outs, two different people I asked that had engine outs. I said, did you see a big difference between that windmilling prop and the idling airplane? And they said not really, because there's the, you know, so I don't know what to tell you. It's like without, we don't think we have really a definitive answer to that without having someone to test that. So I don't think we're qualified necessarily to answer it. I could throw an idea out there. Just someone other, it was a DP, had told me this too. He said that what he did, he had an engine out once, is he slowed the airplane down enough so the propeller stopped spinning, and that way he got rid of all that drag. So I don't know if that's something you'd have the wherewithal to do. I think I'd probably be freaking out a little bit more and trying to handle the situation than worrying about that.
I think a few Google searches would yield information on that topic.
Okay, good point.
I think in some cases it can be dramatic, and in some places, for example, if you have a fixed pitch prop where you can feather the prop, it'll make a difference.
Even on a constant speed prop or something like that. Or,
constant speed prop.
Yeah.
So I would just do a Google. I would ask that same question of the Google and see what comes up, because I know that the drag is less with a stopped prop. But how much less, and is it worth thinking about under the circumstances? I wouldn't worry about it. I would just deal with the rotating prop and learn how your aircraft performs in that circumstance, since that's where you're going to be. The last thing you should worry about is how you're going to figure out how you're going to stop your prop.
Right. Okay. Because it's somebody threw the idea, but actually, I think here's as I'm thinking about this, here's the best recommendation I would give. Just like we would give ourselves lots of leeway on a short field takeoff, soft, all the landings and things like that, we'd say I calculate it out and then I give myself another 50%. Do the same thing with these. Give yourself more options and trying to say, I'm going to give myself a really big margin of safety, that I'm not trying to nail this on the razor's edge. I'm going to get something maybe a little bit closer that might help. So that's probably the recommendation I would give on
that. With the calculations, and I think it's rooted in the fact that there's a lot of variables: wind speed, rising air, sinking air, weight. There's a lot of variables involved in figuring this out. So the question was stated as, how accurate could it really be in practice when seemingly 5 knots or more or less could make a tremendous difference in the outcome of that flight path. Not sure if there's more to expand on there with that.
Again,
maybe it's more like
my thought is that again, you're fine just operating on the rules of thumb. We're not trying to split hairs here.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to go through the theory of why this stuff works so that the rules of thumb would make sense. Why would you speed up in sinking air? Well, I showed you in a detailed sense why that was, but when it happens, you just want to be conscious of the fact that if you're fighting a headwind, don't fly it at the book speed. Fly faster than that. How much faster? I don't know. Just fly faster. Don't fly ridiculously fast because at some point the drag is just going to kick in and make it miserable. But don't fly the book speed. Fly faster than the book speed. If you got a tailwind, slow down a little bit. And again, you're just improving on the situation. And so that was the topic.
Right. All right. A couple related back to the earlier conversation. Just really to sum it up, I think I can say, so minimum sink rate is not best glide speed. And then related to that is why is minimum sink rate less than best glide?
Again, it's going to depend on the speed range of the aircraft. In gliders, it's not a big difference. It might only be 5 or 7 knots in a glider, maybe 10 knots in the higher performance gliders. Airplane, it might be larger than that. Again, I didn't figure this stuff out until after I quit flying airplanes, so I never bothered to figure out what the minimum sink speed was with an idling engine. So I don't have a good frame of reference. You're just gonna have to try it out and see what it is.
Here's an interesting one. What is the first thing you notice when you fly as a GCFI with a high time power pilot, and why do these things happen? What's the first thing you notice?
The first thing I noticed is the first thing that I experienced showing up as a high time airplane pilot for my first glider rating, which is I've got an afternoon, let's get this over with. Airplane pilots already think they understand how to fly an aircraft. And they're going to go through a period of disillusion as they try to learn to fly a glider, as I did. And you just have to let them hit bottom and bring them back up again, because you can't tell them otherwise. So that's my experience typically with airplane pilots, is they think this glider is just going to be as a tinker toy of some kind. It's going to be just like flying an airplane, but easier. And it turns out that it's not. So it's a different type of flying. I tell people you're managing a different energy system here, and you're not familiar with it. So that's been my experience with airplane pilots. I don't hold it against them because I went through it. I understand what they're going through, and I try to be empathetic because I went through the same thing.
And I can tell that's my experience too. Was I don't think I went into it necessarily with the attitude of like, oh, this is going to be easy, but because I'd already flown them a little bit when I first started to fly. But yes, definitely the part of holy cow, what am I doing? And it's humbling, but I will tell you at the same time too, it is freaking cool, especially when your instructor takes you up and starts to teach you how to thermal and stuff. That is the coolest thing ever. So go try it.
So this one starts out by saying, fascinating stuff for sure, exclamation point. And then followed up by saying, what is the best method using ForeFlight or a G3X to find your own personal best glide performance given your existing weight?
You know, on the front of this presentation, I was going to say, we're not going to talk about ForeFlight. I'd be disappointed if it didn't come up in one of the questions. I have no experience with ForeFlight, so I can't answer that.
Yeah, the ForeFlight, I know there's the glide ring on there, and I'd have to dig into it to really fully understand. But as I recall, I think it's based on the glide ratio of the aircraft that you put into the performance there, and so they will estimate that glide ratio and give you an idea. But that's based on the published glide speed, and so
at gross weight.
Right. So what Scott and again, I'm not 100% on that, so don't take me to task for this one. It's like, but what Scott's kind of getting at is it's potentially you could eke some more performance out of this aircraft beyond that. But again, I don't know exactly. My understanding is what ForeFlight does, it takes it and uses the glide ratio to determine that your altitude and the winds as they are and so forth.
By the way, what's interesting is that the flight computers that are built for gliders actually take into consideration the glide polar. The glide polar is input into the software so that the software understands what the performance of the glider is at various airspeeds, and then compares that to your airspeed and does computations accordingly. So it figures all that stuff out for you. It'll figure out what your best glide is based on the headwind that you're facing, and it'll give you a speed to fly.
So it's
But
plugged into it's plugged into the computer-static system then, right? Yeah, it's in the glider. Yeah.
Yep. It's taking airspeed and sync rate and your GPS is telling you what your ground speed is. So that's your geographic best glide. By the way, if that's what the guy who had to fly the Airbus down from 44,000 feet, the first thing he did is he slowed down to the best glide speed. And then he asked air traffic control for his ground speed, and then asked his co-pilot to compute their glide ratio based on ground speed and sync rate. He then determined that he couldn't get to Winnipeg, which is how they ended up at the airport which is an abandoned Air Force base. As a glider pilot, he knew that glide ratio was ground speed over sync rate. He very quickly kind of got a good feel for that, and then decided that there's no way they were getting to Winnipeg, so they went into the Air Force base.
So by the way, real quick,
that is one advantage to having GPS in an aircraft. If you're trying to figure out what your glide ratio is, use ground speed, not your airspeed.
Right. And then real quick, somebody said 4-flight glide ring takes into account the winds aloft, which is true. And then here's one I thought if you could knock out real quick, because I know you talked about this in the last performance, the one that we did the last session, which was, what are the typical glide ratios of gliders? What do you typically see in a glider versus a powered airplane?
The training gliders, the older training gliders, the Schweitzers had glide ratios around 20-1. The modern trainers like the K-21 are somewhere in the mid 30s. The early racing gliders got into the 40s. Most of the higher performance racing gliders now are up in the 50s and 60s, maybe closer to 50s, mid 60s. The best glide ratio I've seen in the world is 70-1.
It's amazing. And a typical powered airplane, I know Cessnas, they're somewhere between 7 to 9-1 in that glide ratio, so way less.
Interesting enough, the 767 was 12-1.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
We had a note from a 1946 Aircoup pilot, and so they said there's no PAOH as we know it, therefore no real published best glide speeds, nor VX or VY. What is the best method to determine the best glide airspeed, short of shutting off the engine and seeing how far I can go?
I don't have an answer. I don't know.
Okay. So would they, if they were to take a set weight, because they could build their own polar, right? You said that you could go through and just kind of note those things from that they could create their own polar, right?
If you built a polar for it, you could figure it out.
And they would just do that by basing it on the sync rate versus the speed they're flying, build that polar, and then they could do that. And then how to use the polars in those glider handbooks I mentioned, like the FAA glider flying handbook shows you how to use a polar.
Yeah, generate the polar, draw a tangent from the origin, and the tangent point hits and then read up to the best glide speed.
So potentially you could make your own using your own observations, obviously keeping in mind that there are errors and things that could happen, but that would give you at least a better idea potentially.
Yeah, it puts you in the ballpark. And again, we're just trying to get into the ballpark.
There you go. A synonym shared for airspeed for maximum time aloft is loiter speed. Is that a term that we've been familiar with?
Yeah, I've heard the term. Loiter meaning stay in the air as long as you can. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Okay. As much as landing in gliders can be a valuable experience for power pilots, experience of being towed is arguably as much of interest, where from the very start planning for rope breaks, tow plane engine failures is critical. Contingency planning all the way up to pattern altitude is a second nature for glider pilots, with important parallels for power pilots. So great benefit there for power pilots to give it a go and to join the gliding world.
Yeah, think about what could go wrong on takeoff. Not a bad idea.
By the way, going back to that previous question, Stephen, not our Stephen, but someone in the audience said the phase 1 test plan from EAA, will describe how to figure out that best glide speed. There's an ASA book he mentions called Flight Testing Experimental Aircraft. ASA, the publisher, Flight Testing Experimental Aircraft, that also has procedures to figure out all your speeds. So there's another way of doing it right there. So go check out those.
Cool.
So Scott, I think you're getting some powered pilots excited about gliding, and David is wondering, where's a good place in the United States to get my glider rating add-on in the next 2 to 3 months, or should I wait for warmer weather and more thermals?
If you go to the Soaring Society of America's website, which is ssa.org, there's an application there called Where to Fly. When you click on it, you get a map of the United States. You can click on the states and it will show you glider operations in that state. And if you click on the glider operation, the little glider icon, it will give you information about that location. So whether it's a commercial operation or a club, hours that they operate, aircraft that they fly, that would be a great place to learn. And there's plenty of places you can learn to fly: Florida, parts of Texas, California, Arizona. They're open all winter.
And that's just an example. That's exactly what I did. In fact, I did my glider rating add-on in November some years ago at Seminole Lake Glider Port was the place that I happened to go. It was in Florida near Orlando. And it was the middle of winter time. We still had cumulus clouds, and Jan, who you know, actually was able to get, he was able to show me thermal, even though I could never master it in that time. But it was really cool. So great experience. And it took for me, I did a commercial add-on. It took 5 days.
Had a medical question for gliders. Is it true that while a pilot needs a pilot's license and a medical to fly powered aircraft, one only needs a pilot's license to fly a glider?
Correct. That's exactly right. You do not need a medical. It's one of the few operations where no medical is required at all.
No medical certificate. That does not absolve you from.
It's true. It's true.
The catch-all that says that if you have any known condition that would prevent you from operating the aircraft safely, you're not allowed to fly. So you're not out of that loop. So you got up in the morning and there's a pain in your left arm. You decide to go flying anyway. My recommendation is always ask yourself, what would the jury say?
Good point. Good point.
Fair assessment. Gentlemen, that takes us to the end of the applicable questions here. So I think we're in good shape.
All right. Great. Let's say, what is this? Gliding is going down, soaring is going up. Somebody mentioned here too. All right. Anyway, Scott, thank you again so much for being with us. This was a really cool one. In fact, I know somebody even said in the comments, this is one of the best presentations we've had all year. So I appreciate that. I knew it was going to be cool because as soon as you showed me that, I'm like, we have to do this one. So I appreciate you sharing that with us. And just thanks. Thanks again for being here.
You're welcome. Never miss an opportunity to listen to my own voice.
So, all right, everybody. I guess that being the case, we're going to call it here in just a moment. Don't forget, next month, I think I'm showing this. Next month of December, we're going to be doing kind of nerding out on aerodynamics, so critiquing the angle. We're kind of playing with critical angle there. If you get that bad joke of ours, aerodynamics are not a drag. So please join us then. And again, if you have any suggestions or questions, email us at ftinitiative@aopa.org. Other than that, Dan and Stephen, thanks here as always for being with us. Scott, we appreciate you, and we will call it and bid you adieu.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Scott.
All right. We'll see everybody next time.